Alright, welcome back to this special go-through of some extra James Bond titles, one of which was a new pickup, and the rest are Japanese imports that were very, very lovingly and thankfully donated for review by Peter Biancardi. So big shout out to Peter Biancardi, because I've wanted to go through these for a very long time, and most particularly The World Is Not Enough, which has been my holy grail of Laserdiscs ever since I even got into this mess years and years ago. So first of all, I'm going to go through the newest disc I picked up, which is the THX reissue of From Russia with Love, the final 1998 disc that MGM put out. Now, of course, I've gone over some of the other THX mastered final disc releases, and these pretty much are the movie-only versions of what would have been a big CAV special edition box set, but due to the format ending, that whole plan kind of got canceled after the Goldfinger and Thunderball boxes, and so you had a last couple movie-only Laserdiscs, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, and then both The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. Now, when those came out, they also were released on very early DVDs in snapper cases in very limited quantities. So they share the same master, and both the Laserdisc and the first DVDs are very rare. This plan later resurfaced as the special edition DVDs, so that's where you get to see all the extras that were originally created for these box sets that never happened. So I've been curious for a long time about the Dr. No and From Russia with Love THX discs, just to see if they were any different. The Goldfinger and Thunderball ones are just, of course, movie-only repressings of their big box sets. The only difference being that the Thunderball one got a 5.1 AC3 track added. So both Dr. No and From Russia with Love are very hard to find this way, and technically it's the last release they got, so it should be technically best overall. I was very happy to get this. Of course, it uses the mid-90s, I've heard it referred to as many different terms, but usually the face or hand with gun artwork. And as you can see, they very lovingly used the whole jacket of this. Here's the tape for comparison. Obviously, the dimensions were just kind of resized, but the jacket still looks really nice. I'll show you the rear cover. I like how they kept the flames running onto the back. It's a nice backdrop. And here you have one of the famous stills of Connery in that same photo shoot. Ironically, I've always liked how that gun looks, but ironically that's just an air pistol, so all those iconic shots of Connery in the tuxedo with the long-barreled pistol of sorts is actually an air pistol, so go figure. Anyway, it's still a single disc, no special features or anything, but what's really nice is that it doesn't seem like they did a huge remastering job. It seems like pretty much the same master that MGM stuck with for their letterbox release. But I will say, it is, if you put it side by side, it's going to be maybe a tad sharper, because this is a later release from 1998 with a THX stamp of approval and all that stuff. Whereas the older master was made in like 92, 93, first for the Connery box set, and then the single disc reissue. That being said, it does seem like the color's kind of been elevated a bit on this, like the other THX discs and the special edition DVDs. So if you've seen that special edition DVD and then looked at any of the earlier Laserdisc transfers, you may notice that the earlier transfers are maybe a bit lighter. So that is something to note. It's very minute, but it is there. Again, I do think it is sharper. Technically, it is a better pressing, but it is overall the same source element as the prior release, which I have it handy here. Here's the individual release, just to refresh your memory, that uses the poster artwork. Now, even the disc break is at the exact same point, so like I said, I think they just used the identical master and just maybe spruced it up a bit. The only difference is both this individual disc and the same disc that's in the Connery box set have the original trailer for the film, which for some reason gets dropped on this THX disc. So that's something to note. If you have the older ones and you pick up the newer one, you may just want to hang on to the old one, if only for the trailer being included. But what was interesting on this release, I kind of skimmed through it. I haven't got to watch it all the way through yet. But there's one small scene when Tatiana Romanova is introduced outside the Russian consulate, where she says goodbye to some friends, and they speak in another language. And it's not subtitled or anything, it's just a few random words of dialogue on the street. But when I was growing up, I remembered some copies used to subtitle it for some reason. And this Laserdisc actually does. They're hard-coded little subtitles on the bottom of the frame for those 3 or 4 lines. And I was just really surprised to see that again, because I hadn't seen that since I was a kid, and I can't remember for the life of me which release did that, because I used to, before I owned the films, I used to rent them all the time or tape broadcast versions, and so I've seen countless different editions of some of these films, and sometimes it's hard to remember. There's also some random versions of You Only Live Twice that subtitle some of the random background street dialogue of some of the Japanese SIS agents watching Bond as he first arrives in Tokyo. But that's something that's exclusive to this release that I just noticed is like a little interesting tidbit. But other than that, it's a fine pressing of the great same master and a better element than what was used on the older versions. But if you already have the Connery Collection Box 1 or the standalone from Russia with Love, it's really not essential. It's just really more for completion's sake, because I'd say they're roughly identical, but it's still a nice release to have, and it's nice to have the final edition on Laserdisc. I will also say lastly that I double checked everything, and again it's the same as the older one, and it's the same as the letterbox tape, because you can't have enough editions of the same video master, but hey, I'm a glutton for punishment. So anyway, but that's not what you were here for, most likely. Let's move on to the fantastic Japanese releases that were once again lovingly donated for review by Peter Biancardi. I cannot stress that enough. I've been dying to see what these look like for years. So we're going to start. He was gracious enough to loan me 2 of the older films in the series, and all of the Japanese releases got pressed in widescreen a little bit later than the US counterparts, in about 92, 93, 94 era, as opposed to the US ones that started in 1989. So first of all, I'm going to show you the Japanese You Only Live Twice in letterbox. And this still has the original Obi strip here, which I'll slip that off so you can get a better look. You see it has the widescreen logo and the MGM UA logo on the top, and then the fact that it's CLV and monaural. Show you the rear, which very strikingly has the stylized gun barrel logo that was used on a lot of it was actually pretty much used on a lot of the early CD soundtrack releases and reissues of the old LP scores. But it's just a nice little marker of the other Bond titles that were being made available in widescreen in Japan finally. And so here, most of the discs in this series use either original Japanese poster artwork like this does, and some use versions kind of sized down of the American art, but it's for the most part the Japanese artwork, which used the sort of photo collage style that they were very well known for. And a lot of these are exceptionally good. Even though I'm not really a fan of the whole photo montage style, I think that the Japanese had such a way with it back in the day. And I think it makes a difference that they're actually using real photos as opposed to how everybody just uses Photoshop now. So a lot of these are, of course, very rare and highly collectible. So it's nice to have a good printing of it, although I do wish they would have used more of the jacket space. I can understand they were trying to keep the aspect ratio intact, but and if you're curious about seeing some of these in like bigger, better print quality, there's several collections of Bond posters out there. Like, for example, Tony Normand's Art of James Bond History of Film Posters book is an exceptional coffee table book. But I digress. Here you see they have the original blurbage with the film's title and credits at the bottom. So it is very classy, although I'm not really a fan of this sort of Agent 007 typeface in the background, but again, I understand they had to do something to kind of break up just having a plain background. Now, most of these are gatefolds, but of course, You Only Live Twice is shorter, so it fits onto a single disc. The gatefolds use the gun barrel with the film's title across, which you'll see in the next one I go over, and it's just a beautiful design touch. And that's actually ties in very well to the US VHS run that was going on at the same time in 92, 93, where they took the gun barrel and the film's title and ran it across the spine. Here's the 92 remastered You Only Live Twice US VHS release, which uses original American poster artwork, size for tape. So you can see they were kind of following the same design as Japan did, and they also did the spine in the same way. So I don't know which came first, but they were at least keeping some continuity. And then this spreads over onto the rear cover, which has the rest of the gun barrel. And all the films were redone in this remastered series, which was really the first time they tried to do like decent panning and scanning on tape for the Bond films. A lot of the earlier ones could be quite lazy with the panning and scanning, so that's what sets these apart. But that was just something interesting I noticed about the casing I wanted to show you guys. But anyway, here you have some nice stills, and it really gives the idea of what the American standalone release would have looked like had it come out in the, about 93, 94, and used the same style of artwork that the Letterbox Man with the Golden Gun and MGM License to Kill did, as opposed to being part of the 1989 series. Now, that being said, the disc itself has a nice label, which I'll show you guys. And it seems like they kept this label for most of these discs. It's just a blue and white MGM UA label, but as you can see, they have the 007 logo on there, which is a really nice touch. But this was also kept and is pretty much found on the World Is Not Enough label as well. So again, I haven't seen all the Japanese letterbox discs, but I'd be pretty certain that they all use some variant of this for continuity's sake. So what really interested me about these is the notion that the transfers might be better because they were pressed later. I know I've read various things over the years on the Laserdisc database forums about people comparing and contrasting and thinking the Japanese versions were better or are roughly equivalent of the American ones. And of course, anytime a disc was pressed later, that means, it could be technically sharper or better made, even though it uses the same source master. Now, I did way too much comparison on these, and I kept going back and forth between this disc and the 1989 US release, which was the first appearance of this same master. They share the same master. It's identical in every single way. But that being said, I did some more spot checking between these two and the reissue in the Connery Collection 2 box set. Of course, the US disc was first pressed in 1989, and this release in the box set was pressed in 1993. Again, it uses the same master, but in going back and forth time and time again, I did find that the box set pressing of You Only Live Twice is marginally sharper. And when I say marginally, I had to just get really close to my CRT, and you can barely notice that there's just an extra degree of sharpness to it, so things could be a tad more clear. However, at the same time that it's sharper, it also has a bit more video noise because the overall transfer is sharper, so any tiny instances of aliasing or video noise will be a bit more noticeable on this release. And then when I noticed that, I kept going back and forth with the Japanese disc and found that it is identical to the Connery box set version, being that this was pressed in 1993. So it's identical to what you get in the box set, so it's a tad bit sharper than the 89 disc. And the only other difference is that, of course, it has hard-coded Japanese subtitles. And I know a lot of people have 16:9 screens, whether it's HD CRT or projection or plasma, and the trouble with Japanese discs is worrying about, having the Japanese subtitles crop up into the image. Sometimes they were placed really low in the letterboxing info, and you can mask that off. But oftentimes they do crop up into the image, and when you do any zooming, or even if you're just watching on a 4:3 set, they do on this release, and Diamonds Are Forever as well, which we'll go over in a minute. So if that's something that you have to worry about, or you'd like to know in terms of hard-coded subtitles, it's not really intrusive. I've seen some discs where they do get super intrusive, but it is there. Usually the top line of a subtitle in Japanese does kind of crop up into the bottom of the image. So it's really nice to be able to see this finally, but I can finally put to rest any notions of people thinking that the Japanese versions are just better because they were made in Japan or made later. Again, I'd love to see all the various ones in this series, but I think for the most part, it's just going to be a difference of they took the same master and just pressed it in 93 versus the US ones that were pressed between 1989 and 1993. So I think you just have to go on a case-by-case scenario. But in terms of these two in this series that I'm taking a look at, they're pretty much identical to what you have in the States. You just have the hard-coded Japanese subtitles. The only other thing I'm going to mention on this is it's kind of a weird player issue I noticed. My main player is a Panasonic LX900, which has really great video performance and audio performance. But it was interesting when I put these discs in, they had a little flag pop up, and for some reason the chapters wouldn't read. So it just acted like it had no chapters at all. And I don't know, I've never run into that problem or issue before, but it actually had a little indicator pop up on my front display, and just for some reason the chapters wouldn't read either on this or the Japanese Diamonds Are Forever. And I tried it on some other players and they all did the same thing. So again, that's just an odd thing that I noticed in reviewing these. I don't know if that's supposed to happen or what exactly, but that is something to note if you do pick these up or have them. And if anyone else has these and has ever had that happen or knows why that happened, just post a comment down below. I'd be very curious to know. So next, Peter very graciously sent me the Japanese Diamonds Are Forever, as I mentioned a minute ago. And here it is. Now here they produced more of the artwork instead of keeping it centered like the Only Live Twice one, so I thought that was pretty cool. Here is the Obi strip, which I'll give you a close-up view. It's pretty much the same idea, just with the difference in titles. Of course, this is still CLV and monaural. And here you have the gun barrel logo again with the other titles. I do really like this jacket. I've always loved this one sheet, but again, you can see they've kind of kept it with the original one sheet dimensions, and or kept it with the VHS tape dimensions, hence the sizing. But instead of putting it in the center this time, they've expanded it to fit top and bottom and kept that Agent 007 typeface, but put it over here and then colored it blue. So I'm not exactly sure why they were doing that instead of just using the entire gatefold, but it still looks great, and anytime you could get original artwork, I'm happy. I do like how they kept the original poster and press material typeface for the cast, crew, and title right down to the 007 logo, although I don't know why they had yellow, kind of orange, red, white, and then this sort of burgundy. But again, anytime you get original artwork, I'm pleased. So it does look very, very nice. It's easily the best cover the film has on Laserdisc, so if you're a cover collector, it doesn't get better than this. Now the gatefold, as I said, they use the original typeface on the gun barrel. These are easily, by far and large, I think the best gatefolds the film series has, period, And as far as I understand it, all of the letterbox releases that had gatefolds in Japan used this with the film typeface. And again, this ties into what they were doing on the remastered 1992 American VHS tapes. So, and here they have the entire one sheet, and of course it's the actual Japanese one, hence the Japanese block at the bottom. So that's a nice touch. I always thought it was really cool when various countries would get to retain their original art materials instead of just being kind of standardized to what came out in the country of origin. Now here's the rear, and again this ties into the layout on You Only Live Twice. You get a nice selection of stills here on the bottom. And what I forgot to mention about the other, but I will about this, if you look closely, these are all directly reprinted from lobby cards and such, and thus have more of a film-like appearance. They have really deep black levels and such. This always jumps out to me. I don't know why they do this. Here they use the iconic still of Connery from Russia with Love, and then the iconic From Russia with Love pre-production artwork here that was used on most of the posters, and between Diamonds Are Forever imagery. So I don't get why they do that, but that's something that the home video departments are well known for. Anyway, here you have the Japanese information on the bottom. It's all CLV across 3 sides, just like the American release. In the Connery box set, the original 1990 letterbox reissue actually has the final side in CAV. So that is something you already lose off the bat if you're going to this or the Connery box set. So show you the disc labels. Now here they swapped them, and they used the yellow version of the gun barrel imagery with the 007 logo. So I don't know for sure which ones used this or a version of this or the blue and white MGM UA label. But the World Is Not Enough goes back to that blue and white. So it'd be interesting to see all the different ones. And again, the EMI used this for all of their first CD releases of the soundtracks in the early 90s. I'd also like to mention they use some pretty sturdy cardboard on these jackets, so that is a very nice touch. They're very sturdy, they're very well printed. So as I mentioned before, the film first was released in 1990 in the standard 89 series jacket with the art and photo collage. And I went over this in my review of the regular series disc, so if you haven't seen that, go check that out for just general background info. Now, unlike You Only Live Twice, when you get to the Connery Volume 2 box set, I did do crazy comparisons of the transfers all over again, and unlike You Only Live Twice, the transfers across the board are the same. There's no difference in sharpness or anything. If anything, the 1990 disc may have a tad bit more noise because it's 3 years older in terms of pressing, but for the most part they're virtually identical. The only difference being is that the side brakes are a little bit different, and they were nice enough to give you the finale on the oil rig in CAV only on this initial release. So the Connery box set and the Japanese disc have all 3 sides as CLV. All 3 do have the original trailer, so they're identical in every single way. Of course, the Japanese release has the hard-coded subtitles, and they do, like You Only Live Twice, for those with projection setups or 16:9 screens, they do intrude a little bit into the picture. So again, that's something to be aware of. But I was very pleasantly surprised. But again, don't seek out these Japanese discs if you're looking for a night and day difference or something that looks 100% better, because I've gone through all 3 versions and they are identical in every single way. So, and also I'd like to point out there's usually a difference in Japanese discs. They may be mastered at a different IRE level for brightness. I didn't have to do any adjustments on all 3 of these, so I was very thankful. That can be a bit difficult to figure out what the correct level is compared to standard American discs, but that's just a side note I want to mention for those who are interested in going the Japanese route. So I'd have to actually argue that For this film in particular, you may be actually best off with the original 1990 release, simply because you get the finale in CAV, which allows you the trick play features, and it's a little bit smoother. But that's just getting to be really, really nitpicky. All three are exceptional releases. It's a really nice master, and of course still has the film's original mono and PCM, and is the best sounding release period of the film. So those were the two Peter were gracious enough to let me look through and finally be able to put to rest if there were really any big major differences between the Japanese letterbox discs and the earlier American ones. And again, I do think if MGM UA had gone ahead and done individual reissues of all the series in about 93, 94 over here, and I think they pretty much would have just looked right like these, just like these Japanese discs with original artwork and such, and thus you would have had individual discs that matched the Letterbox Man with the Golden Gun and MGM License to Kill. But that's not what you guys really came for today, now is it? What I'm getting to now is something I never thought I'd actually be able to see, hold in my hands, let alone view and review. Again, thank you so much to Peter for sending me this. I've wanted to at least just take a look at this ever since I even really found out what a Laserdisc was. This is, of course, the Japanese exclusive final Bond title, The World Is Not Enough, to be released on Laserdisc. Of course, the film was released in 1999, and this disc came out in 2000, so it is one of the extremely rare Japanese exclusive late releases that goes for insane money online. And all of these are extraordinarily collectible, and even if you manage to find one of them, it's definitely something to brag about. These were all pressed in very limited quantities, and most of the only copies that ever made it to the States had to be imported by diehard video people. But by this time, most people were already moving on to DVD because DVD was already getting much stronger at the time. So let me slip this out of the jacket. And this actually includes the original Obi strip, which, anytime you get one of these, especially over here in the States, it's, not always going to be easy to have the original Obi strip still intact. So I will give you guys a close-up. And what's really nice about this is they printed it in gold. If you look closely in the background, the iconic Flame Girl from the advance poster for the film is actually imprinted there, which is just a beautiful touch. This is probably my favorite Obi strip of all time. I'm not really an Obi person. I understand, why they were created, and, some can look really good, some are just a strip of paper, but the fact that they actually printed the Flame Girl on here, that's fantastic. Here you have that it's widescreen, the MGM logo, and the fact that this is Dolby Digital encoded with the AC3 track. It's full CLV on all three sides. It has the stereo surround, Dolby surround encoded PCM, and then it also has the mono fold down on that left analog track. Now the rear is relatively just text. I guess some of this may list some of the other Bond titles, and then just some legal stuff, and then the fact that it is closed captioned. But of course, I don't read Japanese, so that's the Obi strip there. Now here they've used the international artwork. The US one sheet had the whole white background with Brosnan posed differently, but all of the international markets got versions of this. The British release had the bigger version in a quad format as well, and subway posters. Sometimes it's printed in blue and such, and if you've played any of the games based on the film, you should know this image because it was used for most of the loading screens. But here this is pretty much, it seems to be sized for VHS. I don't know if any of the tape releases used this imagery, but that's what this looks like it was sized down for, because the actual image is much wider. I do like that they've gone with a sort of techie looking background. It's blue with these sort of, it looks like lines of latitude and longitude of a globe just kind of overlaid, so that fits with the theme of the film. So I do think that's a nice touch. I wouldn't have known that's what it was unless I was really looking at it up close. So at least they did something with the dead space that fits the film and isn't just like blocks of text, so that's kind of nice. Now the gatefold has a nice overlay. There's the Thames chase, there is the ski chase, and there's the Parahawks, the film logo. It's all printed in black and white, and you get the cast and crew list with a little bit of blurbiage about each, but of course it's all in Japanese. And then here is a little bit of production notes with the still of Brosnan that is the main imagery on the American art for the film. I kind of get what they were doing with this, and it looks nice. I don't know why they printed in black and white instead of color, but you know, it still looks nice at least. I think what they could have done is just reproduce the entire American art here, just kind of going horizontally, and done it in color, or used like just the, of course, I would have just done the famous shots of the Q-boat coming out of the MI6 wall, or probably even better is Bond doing the ski jump with the grenade exploding behind him during the Parahawk chase. But that's just me trying to come up with like really expressive looking gatefold ideas. But it serves the purpose, and it looks nice at least. Now the rear is kind of really interesting. It's much more of a collage style. It does kind of look sort of tape or DVD-ish because it looks like it was sized for different things. Now over here you have the cast and crew listed again, and I guess these are some of the chapter listings, maybe. I'm not exactly sure, but that's very Laserdisc-esque, but everything over here seems like a DVD insert or something. I take that back. The chapters are here. As you can see, it's 3 sides. And but the color printing is very good. The stills are nice. And here you have the Japanese block at the bottom that gives you the nice, all the relevant information and nicely laid out bars that actually have English printing on it so you can read it. I wish American Disc had done that too. Even Blu-rays today half the time don't have those really visible text blocks anymore with the relevant information. So it's a nice looking rear jacket. It serves the purpose, but for such a late release, I do kind of wish they had. I just feel it could be a little bit better in terms of art design, but for what it is, it's very good. That's just me being nitpicky and saying way too many of some of these discs. So enough about the packaging. Let me show you the disc label right now for a moment. As I said before, this pretty much harkens back to what was on the You Only Live Twice disc. It's a blue and white MGM logo. Of course, they've eliminated all instances of United Artists because at this point MGM had completely rebranded and all video was under MGM Home Entertainment. Blue and white CLV, as this is a 3-sided CLV release. And the only other difference, of course, is the fact that you have the Dolby Digital moniker there indicating the AC3 track. But other than that, I guess it was nice that they kept some similarity in the disc labels. Unfortunately, just standard old elephant condoms, no car sleeves. But what is nice about this is that it also has the same kind of thicker style of cardboard used in the cover, just like the other two, so that's nice. It's pretty sturdy, so less chance of ring wear and edge tearing and such. Now, of course, the real reason you tuned into this video and what's been driving me nuts all this time that I've gotten into Laserdisc is the transfer on this. Does this have any potential differences compared to the US releases, particularly in the audio track, and just how does it stack up since it is such a well sought after late Japanese release? Well, in all my years of doing this and researching the Bond titles on video, I really was surprised by the quality in GoldenEye and blown away by the quality of the Tomorrow Never Dies US release. So I was really looking forward to seeing what this could really do. And I was not disappointed for the most part. The video on here is first rate. It's fantastic with a few minor exceptions. First of all, again, I'd like to point out this doesn't have any differences in the IRE level, so you don't have to adjust for brightness like you do on some Japanese discs. In terms of the master itself, it's the same master that was used for the first DVD, the special edition DVD. The film's pretty much had, outside of pan and scan tapes, two masters. The original made for the Laserdisc and DVD, and then it was spruced up and, essentially spruced up in 2006 for the Ultimate Edition, and got a going over by Lowry Digital. And then that was ported over onto Blu-ray, which has, the advantage of being HD, so it's able to vault ahead even of what the Ultimate Edition DVD was. Unfortunately, it's never gotten a fresh 4K scan that's actually been released. The Bond titles have been supposedly all scanned and mastered at 4K, and had a few select theatrical digital screenings, mostly in Europe and the UK, of some titles, but the hope is that eventually they'll hit 4K UHD. I know there's available 4K streaming downloads pretty much on the iTunes store, but it remains to be seen if all of those are true 4K. The photography in this film is actually quite good, and it's got a really nice green structure that actually, if you look very closely on this, it at first looks like a lot of noise, but you can start to kind of make out the grain structure that of course is more visible on the DVD. And just so you have some pictorial reference, here's the versions I went through in comparing. Of course, the special edition DVD, which is the same master as the Laserdisc. And then, of course, just for comparison's sake, I also included my old original copy from when I was a kid, the North American Pan and Scan VHS tape with the linear mono and the hi-fi stereo with Dolby Surround. And then, of course, the Lowry processed Ultimate Edition DVD, which spruced everything up. And of course the Blu-ray as well, but because I have the Bond 50 box, the disc is just a slot inside a big box, so I can't really fit it on here. But since it's also the Lowry reprocessing, it's kind of represented as well by this. And just because I didn't have enough to do, and again, I'm a glutton for punishment, I remembered I still had the, of course, the N64 game, but also the PlayStation 1 game, which actually has real video footage and clips from the film encoded. So on a lark, I also compared the horribly low-res and jerky FMV clips from the PlayStation game, which was really kind of unnecessary, but I figured since I was already comparing every other version, might as well go back to the clips that I saw 5 million times when I played this game and died a lot. But anyway, that's just to give you an idea and a visual representation of what I'm going to start talking about, because this is going to get very nerdy for at least a few minutes. So again, this is really more of a lark because it's the video encoded on here are in small little bits, and it's so low res and kind of jerky that it's really more for just covering all your bases. And because you're such a fan, you still have all of the PlayStation 1 games. I will say the VHS master, it's of course pan and scan, but for a tape, it's actually quite nice. And now that I have a really nice VCR, really more of a prosumer one, a nice Sony deck, where I can really check out the hi-fi stereo as well. It's actually quite well done, and if it wasn't pan and scan, it would be better, of course, but you're still dealing with a lower resolution anyway. Like many tapes, it does seem that the film transfer was brightened up a bit, so it's a bit contrasty, but that's to be expected for VHS. It does have the garbage music video, though, and the tribute to Desmond Llewellyn. Those are not on the Laserdisc, but of course they're present on all the DVDs as well. But I had forgotten that, and that they were included. So had the Laserdisc come out in the States, it may very well have had those just tacked on the end of the third CLV side. But other than that, this was really just more for completeness sake. I did do some comparisons of the hi-fi Dolby Surround compared to the PCM Dolby Surround of the Laserdisc, and they do seem similar, but of course the hi-fi on the tape, although it sounds good, it was much more narrowed and boxed in feeling when comparing to a PCM lossless track. But still not bad, but definitely the least, and it's just more of I wanted to cover all my bases since I never thought I'd ever get to check this Japanese disc out. Most of my comparisons, though, were around the Japanese disc versus the special edition DVD. I was pretty quickly able to tell that it was the same master because I did a lot of comparisons between the DVDs when they came out, and that was my first frame of reference going back and forth. The older master of this film, even though it was 1999 and things were a lot better, when you compare it to the newer ones, it's kind of more the color is a little bit more reddish, especially in the skin tones, which is probably not quite as accurate. You'll notice some color shifts if you toggle back and forth. Luckily, my main display is a Sony XBR960 HD CRT, which has a really nice option Sony put in to do basically defeat the inherent red push of most NTSC CRTs. So when you do a lot of comparisons on CRTs, that's something you kind of have to watch out for, is some could not really be, well, they're almost always going to have a red push, and Sony was nice enough to put that option in there to turn it off. So you're able to get a much more accurate and balanced look. And of course, I have different presets calibrated for DVD, for Laserdisc, so on and so forth, so I can get a very like-for-like comparison. And so I was very, very easily able to tell that it did use the same master as the DVD. Now, as much as I loved Tomorrow Never Dies and how I kind of argued that the standard US Laserdisc kind of outdoes the DVD, this is 2 years later at least, and technically the Laserdisc came out in 2000, so it's really more like 2.5 years, 3 years later. Where Tomorrow Never Dies was based on an earlier video master that I think the Laserdisc kind of worked better than the DVD, which was a little more harsh and digital looking and had a lot more edge enhancement and stuff. This is the point where you start to get where the formats kind of converge, because I think what this Laserdisc represents is as good as the format could possibly get for the most part, whereas the DVD is well made, but of course was bettered by the Ultimate Edition later on and then the Blu-ray. But the trade-offs in the Laserdisc and the excessive cost versus the extraordinarily low cost of the DVD, and the fact that they were able to even put all the extras that have been prepared on the same disc even and not hurt the transfer, and the fact that this also carries the Dolby 5.1 as well, this is where you start to see the point where DVD really kind of had taken over. And as much as I want to say the Laserdisc is great, and which it is, it does have its own inherent flaws. It's not perfect. It's going to require a lot of really nice high-end gear or a really great display and a really great player to, really just, knock your socks off, as compared to the ease of just popping a DVD in on almost any display. So that's kind of to be expected. But what I was really surprised by is, going back and forth, the Laserdisc does have a little bit more color to it, whereas the SE DVD, for short, is a little bit less colorful. It's not really a skin tone saturation thing, but it's kind of a difference in mastering for analog versus mastering for digital. And then if you go over to the Ultimate Edition and the Blu-ray, you'll notice that some of the color that you see on the Laserdisc actually comes back. So I think overall the most balanced look you're going to get for the film is actually on the Blu-ray, which itself is not perfect, and I'd really love to see a proper 4K scan of the film. I think it would be a knockout. That being said, I think all the releases look good, but as much as I want to like the Laserdisc, it does have a little bit of aliasing that crops up, particularly in a lot of the backgrounds and a lot of the wide shots of exteriors. And most particularly, you're going to notice it when Bond first arrives in Azerbaijan and is driving the BMW Z8 through the oil fields. You see through all the oil derricks in the desert. It's really noticeable. It's so noticeable that I think some of it was baked into that master, because even on the DVD you see just a tiny bit of it. But otherwise, all those aliasing issues are relatively gone on this. Now, that being said, if you go back and forth, you will notice the DVD does kind of look a little bit more harsh. I know a lot of people used to argue that DVDs, especially early on, kind of looked digital. This doesn't have it to the same degree that the Tomorrow Never Dies first DVD does, but if you go back and forth, the DVD is far sharper overall. It does have a little bit more edge enhancement to it as well, but in addition to the a little bit of video noise, because this is an earlier transfer, you actually see some of the film's grain structure coming through. So there is a significant difference in sharpness and picture detail as opposed to the Laserdisc, but the Laserdisc itself feels it feels a bit more natural, feels smoother. But that being said, I did notice it does have quite a bit of, well, I wouldn't say quite a bit, but it has like a light amount of video noise that, of course, is going to be inherent to almost any Laserdisc. But it is a bit more than I would have expected for a release of this era, coming out in 2000 in Japan. And just to, kind of clear my eyes and make sure I was still thinking straight, I went back and put on the Tomorrow Never Dies disc again and compared it to the DVD back and forth just to get a clearer frame of reference. And I will go ahead and say that, while this is also not perfect, no release is perfect, this release does not have as much noise in the transfer as the Japanese Twine does. So that is something to note and something that I thought was quite interesting. Now, what really, I was very pleasantly surprised by the picture. It's not necessarily the best Laserdisc I've seen, but it's definitely in there in the top 10 or 15 for picture easily. It's quite excellent, and it's very watchable. The other thing is, of course, it does have the hard-coded subtitles in it, and fortunately they don't really encroach into the picture. So again, if you have a 16:9 display and you have to do zooming, or you use scalars and custom ratios, or have a projection set up, you won't really have an issue there. The interesting thing I did notice is when there are location captions, those are also subtitled. But there was one where when the MI6 Scotland headquarters are first introduced, that there's dialogue going on during the establishing shot. So if you look at that and you have your setup and you have the subtitles masked out, because they had to be subtitles for the dialogue, they actually put a video subtitle in the frame to subtitle the MI6 Scotland headquarters. So I think that was the only one there was, but that's just something interesting I haven't encountered often. So again, just something for those who try to mask subtitles out of Japanese discs with various setups. So, but the sound is what I was really most interested in, because, of course, there's a great history of Laserdisc tracks being unaltered soundtracks and not remixed for near-field home listening environments or iPhones or soundbars or Netflix streaming, so on and so forth, like a lot of other releases starting in the DVD era are. And what I've found for the most part with the Brosnan era is there's not a whole lot of remixing that's gone on, so the films sound correct pretty much across the board in terms of format. It's really just as you go on, more modern tracks, particularly the Ultimate DVDs, may have had their levels kind of adjusted. That seems to happen quite often, where the mix may stay the same, but it may go up a couple decibels, and why that's done or who does that, I have no idea. It's just a general thing I've noticed. But of course, this was the first film in the series to be mixed in the Dolby EX format. And there was an interview with the film's mixer who talked about, this new technology that was first implemented on The Phantom Menace. And basically, Dolby EX was for all intents and purposes, it was a way of matrixing in a center rear channel in the 5.1 configuration that if you had the correct decoder and you had extra speaker channels, or you could even do it without them, you could still get the effect, but it's better if you had them. And what it would do is it basically mix extra center rear information into the left and right rear surround of a 5.1 setup in a theater. And so the idea was that instead of having an extra 6th channel of regular speakers, you could essentially hide them in there and then decode them back out for extra effects in the direct rear center of the auditorium. And this was a new thing that Dolby was pushing. DTS came out with their own version called ES, and but it really didn't take off in theaters. A lot of theaters didn't really implement it, and then it really kind of got more successful on home video in terms of a marketing ploy and getting people to put in extra speakers and channels. And after a couple years, I think it was THX who realized that having essentially 6.1 could mess with audiences listening and cause like general confusion in terms of not exactly knowing where sounds came from in a mix, and that it'd be better off to split that center rear into 2 and thus create the 7.1 configuration. And that started with Toy Story 3 and pretty much just took off until it became like a de facto standard of most mixers and most theaters, and they didn't really publicize it, and it just became the new 5.1. But in any case, the film's mixer in that interview basically said that, you know, he kind of researched it, and then during the mix he kind of just left the decoder on, so while they mixed it would just pull various effects into the center rear, and you can actually hear that, and you don't even have to have a Dolby X turned on, or most monitor receivers you would just turn on the ProLogic 2X and a 7.1 rig. But you can actually hear it in just standard 5.1 if you have your speakers properly positioned, particularly when they're at ear level, and you'll hear various things almost feel like they're coming from directly behind you. It's a much more direct style of imaging the surround sound directly around and behind the listener position, but because it wasn't, you know, specifically designed with particular effects placed there like some films were, like The Phantom Menace for example, it's much more just an overall, every once in a while you get that sensation. And I was always afraid that would get mixed out, because most of these tracks when they came out on home video they would be marketed as EX or ES, or sometimes even put as discrete 6.1, and then that just kind of died away and they just get reissued on Blu-ray as 5.1. But I quickly realized that once it's mixed that way, it pretty much stays that way, and then you can use whatever receiver setting to decode that back out if you have extra speakers, or if you have a correct setup, you can still hear that design with just 5.1 speakers. So I was very curious to see if this 5.1 EX track on the Laserdisc AC3 was going to be like really different, like the Phantom Menace Japanese disc has the original theatrical EX AC3, whereas the DVD here was a different cut and was remixed and didn't have the same dynamic punch. And that is not the case here. Pretty much the track sounds the same. I think the Laserdisc is mastered just a tiny bit quieter, so you will have to, if you were to compare these, if you ever are actually able to obtain one of these, you'd have to you know, do a loudness matching of the two tracks. That's kind of what I had to do going back and forth. So thankfully this special edition track seems to port the Laserdisc audio without changing anything. Like I said, I had to just normalize my receiver by like 3 or 4 clicks, but they seemed pretty much identical otherwise. Of course, this is the standard 384 kilobits per second that Laserdisc could carry, and Tomorrow Never Dies DVD was as well, the first one, but this one ups it to the DVD standard of 448 kilobits per second. Not that it really makes much of a difference, but anytime you can get more data in there, it can only help. But I would say the 5.1s do sound pretty much identical, and that carries over to the Ultimate Edition, both on the Dolby and DTS tracks. Of course, DTS on DVD was mastered louder, so you have to, again, volume match those two tracks to compare them. And of course, DTS has a higher bitrate on DVD, so it can be a little bit punchier, but overall the mix is still the same. And then that carries over to the Blu-ray, which has DTS HDMA, and the same thing with being able to hear the additional rear EX information. That's still there. And again, you can decode it if you want to, or you can still hear it in a properly set up home theater environment. So the sound is pretty much the same. What is interesting about the Laserdisc, though, is of course it carries a PCM matrix surround track. And I was quite interested to see what that would sound like, because a lot of times you either get roughly the same thing as the 5.1, but of course it's not discrete, so it's not able to have all the extra tiny effects here and there. Sometimes they did a good job of mixing the 2.0, sometimes they didn't, and it sounds very muted, or it sounds like, the poor man's 5.1. But most of the time, you still get an excellent experience. And you do hear, of course, the dialogue comes across a little bit more forceful because it's all based around that center channel with the dialogue coming out. And of course, this film has a lot of little tiny discrete effects all over David Arnold's score, which has a lot of electronic influences. But there's also tons of little bullet whiz bangs and extra parts of explosions. And then a lot of that stuff that comes out of the rear EX information is, of course, a lot more audible and a lot more forceful on the 5.1. So, again, I was very pleasantly surprised with the PCM 2.0, and it matrixes out back quite well, but it does not have the same force or punch as the 5.1. You miss all kinds of little things like... Again, like I said, the bullet whiz bangs. There's a lot of really loud, very realistic sounding gunshots in the film's mix, which I've always loved. Those are much more discreet in the 5.1, of course. But then you miss little things as well, like during the Thames boat chase, when the rocket engines of the Q-boat kick on. They're specifically mixed in the 5.1 to have a little boost in the LFE channel, so your subwoofer will kick in really nicely with those every once in a while. And that's not quite in the matrixed audio because, of course, the subwoofer is just pulling from the main channels instead of having a specific boom track mix to it. So it's really nice to have and to finally be able to hear the 2.0. But again, if this disc had come out in the States, that's probably what you would have gotten, and it would have been a nice alternative. But this is a film where the 5.1 is really the way to go, particularly with the additional little bits here and there in the EX mode. All that being said, I've never felt this film had as ballsy of a mix as Tomorrow Never Dies, because that is a huge powerhouse action mix. And of course the film is pretty much 2 hours of mostly non-stop action and gigantic set pieces, whereas of course this film was designed to be much more character driven. And so I get that, and the mix is good overall, but I've just never felt it was quite up there in terms of being like a great 5.1 surround show-off piece like actually any of the other three Brosnan films. Goldeneye has that wonderful low end and just sounds great that it's a modern mix, but with a lot of older sound effects libraries still kind of kept in the fold. So it's like a nice mix of the modern 90s style of mixing with elements of the 60s, 70s, and 80s kept in there. Tomorrow Never Dies is a huge balls to the wall, fantastic sounding mix. And, for all the crap it gets, Die Another Day has a great audio mix that sounded fantastic in the theater, sounded fantastic on home theater. That first DVD actually has, that mix was also EX and DTS ES. And that first DVD has those tracks discreetly encoded, so if you want to play around with that, you can pick that up. But yeah, if you were to watch all four Brosnan films back to back in a home theater, I think you'd be able to notice that while the mix is good, it's just not like as immediately wow-inducing as the other three. But going back and listening to all these and doing a really in-depth comparison has made me really appreciate the mix more. It's, of course, a lot more subdued because the film itself kind of is. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Now, I kind of just did a quick demo of the analog tracks. But again, you're just looking at a tiny mono fold down of the whole film audio on that left analog. Of course, the right analog has the AC3 on it. So pretty much, if you wonder what that sounds like, just grab the old VHS tape and make sure you're listening to the linear track, and that'll pretty much give you an idea of what this film sounds like in mono. And actually, I have to admit, everything still comes across pretty well. It still works rather well in mono, so that was interesting. But this sadly does not hold any magic secrets like some rare Japanese late issues do. I will say that if this had come out in the States, I pretty much expect it would have looked exactly like this. Probably would have been distributed by Image, because they pretty much took over a lot of the late releases for a lot of studios, particularly MGM. But of course, what sadly didn't happen, because it didn't come out in the States, is it didn't receive what MGM most likely would have done and gotten a DTS release. MGM had pretty much done a deal, I think, with DTS, and for a while was even using DTS to do the matrixing on their PCM tracks for all their Laserdiscs for a couple years in the late 90s. So it's pretty certain that if it had come out here in the States, that it would have gotten a DTS rendition, and that, of course, would have been fantastic and lovely to compare, but sadly it did not happen, because at this point, you know, even MGM didn't do a special edition on this Tomorrow Never Dies like they did for GoldenEye. They just did the standard AC3 release. And I think in a lot of ways this is the template for what The World Is Not Enough got, and I think we're just lucky it even came out on Laserdisc in Japan, because pretty much was just seemed like they were already gearing up for DVD, and they abandoned all the Bond Laserdisc special editions and box sets that they had planned. And if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think the okay, yeah, I did. I thought it came out in 2001, but this special edition DVD pretty much did come out in 2000. So I think somebody at MGM just made the decision to just go straight into promoting the DVD and just not even bothering with bringing this Laserdisc over to the States. And I think that's pretty much where most of the studios had gotten to by this point in 2000. Of course, you know, the last run of American discs were all in late 1999, early 2000 anyway, so I think this is just a further example of where the line in the sand had been drawn and the door had been closed. So it's really interesting to finally be able to do this, and with a title that not only bridged the millennium, but bridged the gap in analog and digital video. So it's really great if you ever get the chance to do this with one of these Japanese late releases and compare it to the other versions, and something I've always wanted to do. And in some ways, I'm glad that the Laserdisc does not hold any magic secrets, because now I can stop worrying that I don't have hundreds of dollars to drop on one of them. I'd still love to have one. This has been my most wanted Laserdisc ever since I started even collecting, because the Bond films are what got me into collecting Laserdiscs in the first place. But I'm also sad in a way that there's not some little, interesting tidbit or little extra or, exclusive little thing or bit of theatrical accuracy that was locked away in the legendary Japanese late release that I could never in any humanly way possibly hope to ever afford. So it's sort of bittersweet in that way, but I'm just so excited I finally got to check this out. Like I said, picture quality, audio quality are both great. Like I said, it's definitely one of the best discs I've ever seen in terms of picture. Not totally perfect, not the best I've seen, but pretty darn near close. And the audio is excellent, even though you got to keep in consideration the audio mix itself is a bit more subdued than the immediate predecessors. But again, many thanks have to go out to Peter Biancardi for allowing me to check these Japanese discs out particularly this one, and I'm just absolutely flabbergasted that I'm even able to look at this and hold this in my hands and then talk to you guys about it. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope I haven't rambled on too long, because God knows I could talk about even just this film for the rest of time. But hopefully this helps and gives you some idea of what this is like. Again, it's really, you're never able to really tell until you just put the disc in motion, because screen caps and digital captures are one thing, but until you're actually able to see particularly analog video in motion on like a CRT or a proper display, I don't think you can really get the actual feel of how a transfer is going to look. Because a lot of times Laserdisc captures can look terrible and reveal every single flaw of the format, and I always try to actually see a disc before I talk about it, or at least see it in motion for a minute to just get an idea physically. So this has just been a real treat, and hopefully you guys can eventually see a copy of this for yourself one day.